Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you to the library for having me here, and thank you all for showing up today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are here today on the unceded territory of the Albany people. And I also want to acknowledge all of the tradespeople who created this building and keep it clean and safe for us today. I'm going to share with you today the story of how the idea for this book came about and what I've learned along the way in my attempts to talk with people with very different political orientations from my own. I'm guessing that most of the people in this audience are somewhat left of center, and that's who I'm addressing myself to in this book and here today. So if you're conservative, you're of course more than welcome to be here. You'll just have to put up with a leftist perspective that takes certain facts and values as a given. A couple of months before the 2016 election, I started getting a horrible sinking feeling that maybe Trump was going to win. At that time, I was studying something called powerful non-defensive communication, which I'll say more about later. And it occurred to me that the communication principles that I was learning to use in family and workplace interactions could also be used in political discourse. I wrote an article about how to talk to people who were considering voting for Trump in ways that wouldn't put them on the defensive. Because when people feel like they're being attacked, they go into fight or flight mode, and their ability to reason and have empathy completely shuts down. So in this article, my advice was, don't tell them they're deplorable bigots. Just find out what they like about Trump and then share your concerns. And then Trump won, and I immediately forgot all of my own advice and started doing the opposite of what I wrote in that article. I didn't care what misguided reason some fool had for voting for Trump. I was just too blown away to care. I had huge contempt for the 63 million Americans who had put in office someone who was, to me, not only unqualified in every conceivable way, but was more self-promoting, dishonest, and hateful than anyone I had ever seen on the national stage. I took to referring to Trump as Bloatus, biggest liar of the United States. And that was a compliment compared to some of my other names for him. My level 10,000 disdain for Trump got mixed up with my disdain for his supporters, and I got addicted to contempt because contempt feels better than despair and dread. Then a couple things happened. First, I watched a TED Talk by a guy named Dave Fleischer, who heads the Los Angeles LGBT Leadership Lab. He talked about this campaign where they ran, where activists went door to door in Miami talking to people about a local transgender bathroom law. And he showed a video of a transgender canvasser named Virginia talking to an elderly man named Gustavo, who starts out by saying he doesn't support the law because where he's from in South America, they don't like fags. Virginia then tells him that Virginia, is gay and trans. And Gustavo asks, "What makes you decide to be gay?" And Virginia says, "It wasn't a decision, it's just who I am, and I love who I love." And then they get into this whole conversation about how each of them loves their partners, and they're showing each other pictures on their phones, and it's all very warm and cuddly. Eventually, Virginia brings the conversation back round to the bathroom law, and they talk about that. And by the end, Gustavo says, "This is the first time, and I thank you, that I could ask questions like this and be responded to with elegance. Listen, probably I was mistaken." It is an absolutely incredible moment. And this wasn't just a miraculous one-off. A team of Stanford and UC Berkeley researchers monitored the campaign, and they found that the people who the canvassers talked to were substantially more supportive of the anti-discrimination law than those who had not been canvassed, and that their support held firm even after they were exposed to viciously transphobic attack ads. So I was very impressed with this campaign. And around the same time, I heard the story of Derek Black. Derek was the godson of none other than David Duke, and the son of a leading white supremacist named Don Black. They did a white nationalist radio show together. At age 18, Derek was a rising star in the white nationalist movement. Then he went to college and was befriended by Latinx and Jewish students who knew who he was and decided that instead of retaliating against him or trying to shame him out of his racism, that they wanted to try to lead him out of hate simply by interacting with him. One of them invited him to Shabbat dinners, where they engaged in respectful conversation and, believe it or not, became friends. To make a long story short, Derek's racist belief structure fell apart, and the decent, loving person that was always somewhere deep inside him came to the forefront. After graduation, he publicly renounced white nationalism in a New York Times op-ed, and he has been a powerful anti-racist voice ever since. I decided that if Jewish and Latinx students could befriend a white supremacist, then I could have a conversation with Trump supporters. So it's now almost a year after the election, and I write another article, this one homing in on the issue of contempt, which by this time I was beginning to see having a corrosive effect. Both sides were laying it on thick, no one more than Trump. But I wanted to focus on the left's bad because I saw contempt toward Trump and his supporters as hurting our cause. After I published the article, I got an email from a Republican who had read it. He wrote, "I give you a begrudging hat tip. You hit the nail on the head. I'm not sure I want to share your article on Facebook because I don't want liberals to learn the lesson you're trying to teach them. I'd rather they keep shooting themselves in the foot." And I thought, I'm going to write a book. When I started writing the book and having conversations with conservatives, the hardest part was confronting in myself the sense of superiority that I felt as someone who's politically progressive. I saw anyone who didn't align with my worldview as wrong, probably ignorant, and maybe deluded, and above all, morally inferior. In studying powerful non-defensive communication, I learned that coming across as superior is counterproductive in the extreme. But even after learning this, there was still this residue of self-righteousness leaking out and alienating the people that I wanted to reach. I was having a bunch of online conversations on Nextdoor about the homelessness crisis in Berkeley, and I got called out again and again for compassion shaming. I didn't think that's what I was doing, but I was, because I was basically saying, if you don't have the same degree of compassion toward homeless people that I do, and if you don't demonstrate your compassion by endorsing the same solutions that I do, then you're a worse person than I am. That didn't go over so well. I'll tell you the exact moment when my feeling of superiority came crashing down. Ever since college, I've done small things to help homeless people out with legal assistance and food and money. And over the years, I've agonized over the issue of whether to give cash to people who seem to be struggling with substance abuse. For a long time, I did. And then starting maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I came to the conclusion that I was doing more harm than good and that I didn't want to give someone the $5 that they might spend on a substance that would kill them. Anyway, about a year ago, I was reading one of my favorite lefty magazines, and the author starts going off on a rant about people who refuse to give cash to homeless people. He made some very valid arguments about this, and as usual, I felt torn. But here's the clincher. He said that anyone who won't give cash is simply a terrible human being who should be ashamed of themselves. And I was like, how dare you? You don't even know me, and you're accusing me of being a terrible person, you self-righteous little punk? And as my indignation boiled over, I realized that he had done to me what I was doing to conservatives. I was more subtle about it, but they got the message that I saw them as morally inferior, and they stopped listening to me. I didn't have a chance of getting through to them from that point forward. All I was doing was entrenching them in their position, because when people feel judged or under attack in any way, they get defensive. The mind closes, the mental shield goes up, and no learning or empathy can happen at that point. Here's the process I see playing out. If I think that I'm better than someone because of something I believe that they don't, then inherent in that sense of myself as being superior is a judgment of them as being inferior, or maybe even a bad person. And if they pick up on that feeling of being judged, then they are likely to react by feeling alienated. And now there's a gap between us. And that gap is a breeding ground for distrust and possibly even hatred. This book is about setting aside feelings of moral superiority so that you can be in conversation with another human being, even if that other human being has said or done things that you believe are harmful, like voting for Trump. Being in a respectful dialogue doesn't mean soft-pedaling your beliefs. It doesn't mean suppressing your anger or your hurt or your fear. It means doing what the Buddhist monk and peace activist Thich Nhat Hanh says: speak the truth, but not to punish. That's it. That's like my whole book in 7 words. And the reason those 7 words resonate so strongly for me is that my core belief system doesn't have a place for vindictiveness. I believe that people deserve a basic level of dignity, even if they've screwed up. I believe people should have a roof over their head and food and medicine, even if their own behavior contributed to their poverty. I prefer restorative justice to the carceral system because restorative justice honors not only the victim, but honors the humanity of the wrongdoer at the same time that it holds the wrongdoer accountable. When people do things I don't understand or don't approve of, I try to have empathy, which doesn't mean agreeing or excusing what they did. It just means trying to understand what's it like to be them. Why did they gamble away all their money, or join a hate group, or grab a woman by the pussy? It's not as simple as, oh, they're just bad or weak-willed people. I see wrongdoers not as monsters, but as people who are cracking under the strain of a culture of disconnection, indifference, and cruelty. I see people as more than the worst thing they've ever said or done, and it makes me want to speak the truth to them, but not to punish. So, how do we speak the truth, but not to punish? The method I found to be most valuable is powerful non-defensive communication, which was created by a very brilliant woman I introduced earlier named Sharon Strand Ellison, who has taught the technique to educators, legal professionals, and corporate and nonprofit leaders. She trained activists who successfully defeated a ballot initiative in Oregon that would have prevented gays and lesbians from teaching in public schools. And she coached candidate Barbara Roberts, who went on to become Oregon's first woman governor. The non-defensive communication process begins with asking the other person curiosity questions. And then you listen to their answer. And you really listen, not just pretend to listen while you figure out what you want to say. Sometimes what people say in response to curiosity questions is surprising. Sometimes they bring up things I've never even heard about before, and I realize I have something to learn. Sometimes they say something that hints at common ground. That's always nice. Sometimes they say something that I strongly disagree with. And then I can respond by making a position statement. And the book goes into detail about how to do that. What I have found in talking to conservatives after years of not talking to them at all and making a lot of overgeneralized assumptions about them is that their views are usually more nuanced than I had assumed. I was in Kentucky in October canvassing for Andy Beshear, a Democrat who was challenging the incumbent Governor Matt Bevin, who was trying to repeal Medicaid expansion. I knocked on the door of a middle-class white guy in his late 60s and asked him who he planned to vote for. And he said he was a lifelong Democrat who voted for Trump and thinks Trump is doing a great job, and that he was on the fence because he thought the Republican governor was a jerk, but agreed with the Republican that Medicaid expansion was not a good idea. He told me he had worked his way up from nothing, owned a small refrigeration business, and had seen workers who would rather stay home smoking pot than put in a full day's work. And now those slackers were crying about how they needed free health care. Meanwhile, he was just over the income limit for government-subsidized Obamacare. So he was paying full price for health insurance, and he resented the lazy people who wanted it for free. Somewhere along the way, he mentioned that he wanted me to know that he wasn't talking about black people, in case that's what I was thinking. I was. He knew that most people on Medicaid are white, and the slackers he was talking about were white. So I had already heard some version of this grievance narrative a few times that night, and I had given my usual reply, which is that Medicaid expansion is a good deal for Kentucky because the federal government pays for 90% of it, and that Kentucky will end up paying more when uninsured people wind up in emergency rooms, blah, 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 all very logical and rational, an argument only a liberal could love. So this time I said to him, you know, have you heard about this thing about how the human brain is Velcro for negative experiences? We're wired that way. We fixate on the bad and ignore the good. And I think what might happen sometimes is there's this focus on the handful of people who we might see as having made bad choices or being lazy. I'd rather err on the side of having a handful of people get Medicaid who maybe don't need it than having thousands of people who do need it lose out. I said this in kind of a low-key way. It was the end of my 5-hour shift, and I was too tired to be adamant. And as soon as I said it, I felt this kind of shift in his energy. His intensity deflated, and he said, "Oh, I don't want that to happen. I care about people. I'm a Catholic, and my religion is about caring for the sick." And his voice was quavering a little when he said it. I could tell he really meant it. And then he told me about a sick relative whose medical bills he was helping pay. And then I said, "You seem like a caring, generous person, and it seems to me like your values are more in line with Bashir's than Bevin's." And he kind of nodded, and I handed him some literature, and that was that. I don't know how he wound up voting, but I do know that if I had written this guy off the minute he said he liked Trump, then the opportunity for me to lean into his decency would never have emerged. Now, I don't know what you all think of this story, and maybe some of you are saying to yourself, well, that's a nice story, but that's just one voter who may or may not have flipped. Who cares? Here's why it matters. Bashir, the Democrat, won the Kentucky governor's race by 5,000 votes. If we hadn't been out there talking across the divide, Governor Bevin would still be in office trying to take away people's health care. The same goes for 2020. We don't need to flip every persuadable voter. We only need a few thousand voters in a few states, and we're not going to win them over by demeaning them. Not all liberals and progressives are disdainful, but I see it enough and see the negative impacts enough that I think it's worth flagging as an unforced error. I'm sure most of you remember when Clinton said that half of Trump's supporters belong in a basket of deplorables. 2 days after she said that, the Trump campaign started running this ad.
Speaking to wealthy donors,
really loud.
Hillary Clinton called tens of millions of Americans deplorable.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
People like you, and you. Deplorable. You know what's deplorable? Hillary Clinton viciously demonizing hard-working people like you.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
So this ad aired 765 times, mostly in battleground states, and it got incorporated into another attack ad that became the most aired ad of the entire campaign. It was political gold for Trump. Around the time of the deplorables gaffe, a Clinton campaign consultant named Diane Hassan was just finishing up a summer of interviewing 250 undecided voters in swing states. Here's what Diane says about that summer. There was one moment when I saw more undecided voters shift to Trump than any other, when it all changed, when voters began to speak differently about their choice. It wasn't FBI Director James Comey. It wasn't Benghazi, or the emails, or Bill Clinton's visit with Attorney General Loretta Lynch on the tarmac. No, the conversation shifted the most during the weekend of September 9th, after Clinton said you can put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. All hell broke loose. Diane goes on to talk about a guy named George, who she describes as a 58-year-old working-class Democrat from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, who was disgusted by both Trump and Clinton. George told me that his neighborhood was outraged, that many of his hard-working, church-going, family-loving friends resented being called that name. He told me that he looked up the word in the dictionary and that it meant something so bad that there is no hope. You know, he said, Clinton ended up being the biggest bully of them all. Trump bullied her, but she bullied Wilkes-Barre. So I'm not going to read her whole thing, but she describes how after that, George ended up going to a Trump rally and had the time of his life because Trump was saying that the rally goers were smart and he was making them feel good about themselves for a change. Here's Diane's conclusion. These voters didn't like either candidate. They just wanted to be understood. At the end of the day, they cared less about Trump's temperament and more about whether he got them. They were smart. They knew the cheers. Trump gave them a voice, and he certainly didn't think they were deplorable. So where do we go from here? I have learned that instead of speaking about each other, we need to speak with each other. If you had asked me to describe a Trump voter last spring, I would have been largely wrong about their motivations, dreams, and even their values. Sure, there are extremists among them, but it was eye-opening to realize how legitimate the concerns of many are, and to realize that if I just listened hard, I would find that I have more in common with the Georges of the world than I could ever have imagined. I think there is such a huge lesson in this story about how voters like George feel rejected by a party that treats them with contempt, and how this feeling leads them to support a con artist like Trump who pretends to honor and respect them. I want to show you just a few examples of the kind of contempt I'm talking about. The worst examples are, of course, from social media. So we're in the blue on the left, so that means we're smart, so don't worry. This is, you know, the trope of the stupid redneck, beer-drinking, hillbilly racist. This is how we see them. I have talked to so many people who say they used to be moderately conservative, but have moved to the far right because they're so antagonized by liberal contempt. And they love people like Trump who avenge them. Arlie Hochschild, in her book Strangers in Their Own Land, talks about a Louisiana woman who loves Rush Limbaugh. Why? Because he defends her against the epithets liberals toss at people in the South. Backward, ignorant, fat, sexist, redneck. She calls Rush her brave heart. I used to think that this trope of the illiberal elite snob was just a right-wing media talking point, and it is. But I've read enough studies and heard from enough ordinary people to see that they truly feel scorned and are moving to the right as a result. To put this in terms that may be easier to understand if you're a lefty, imagine you're on the fence between voting for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. Just imagine. And all of a sudden you hear Warren supporters saying that if you don't vote for Warren, you're a sexist. Are you going to say to yourself, oh wow, I guess I'm a sexist for even considering voting for Sanders. I better vote for Warren to prove to myself and the world that I'm not a sexist? Probably not. I think that the most likely response is to be aghast that you're being accused of sexism, and then to start reminding yourself of all the good reasons you have for liking Sanders, and all the reservations you have about Warren. And voila, your defensiveness against the charge of sexism has increased your support for Sanders and decreased your support for Warren, which is the opposite of what the Warren booster wanted. In my conversations with conservatives, I've consistently found them to be more nuanced and principled than I had presumed. My biggest takeaway from talking to people across the divide is that people contain multitudes, and that once I get to know them even a little bit, I can't hate them. There are very few people in this world who are irredeemably rotten to the core, and also not too many saints. Not a saint. Trump is the master divider. He knows how to hijack people's feelings of humiliation and shame and loss and convince them that he will avenge them. He will humiliate the humiliators. He trolls the left and the media by saying or tweeting something outrageously offensive, and then we get outraged and say that Trump and anyone who supports him is a horrible bigot, and then Trump says to his base, see, they hate you. They're your enemy. I'll protect you from them. That us versus them tactic doesn't work so well if we don't play along as the humiliators. I came across this comment on a New York Times article that I think is a window into the psychology of someone who is vulnerable to being lured in by Trump. I am an old FDR Democrat. I am reasonably coherent, respectful, and articulate. But whenever I try to talk politics with my progressive friends and relatives, I am met with a sneering laugh, openly derisive and dismissive of anyone so stupid that they do not see the virtue of unlimited illegal immigration, questions the recent orthodoxy that there is no such thing as male and female, or tries to explain that condescending contempt is a poor way to garner votes. These are highly educated people. One of these is a senior professor of sociology, another a Pulitzer-winning author, another a distinguished lawyer. The laugh is always the same, as if they practice it together, a nearly hysterical giggle of embarrassment that anyone could be so stupid. I am made to feel as if I am mentally deficient, and they can't wait to change the subject to end the embarrassment of being in the presence of a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal. Just imagine how a conservative reacts to this treatment. I have seen a lot of other comments along these same lines. These are ordinary people, not professional propagandists, so I take what they say seriously. I don't want to surrender them to Trump. If they go to Trump because they like his policies, so be it. But I'll be damned if I'm going to push them into Trump's corner by sneering and jeering at them. As one regretful Trump voter put it, you need to give us a chance to admit we made a mistake without making us feel bad about it. There are 23 million working class voters who have been identified as persuadables in 2020. 7 million of them voted for Obama and then for Trump. And huge numbers of swing voters flipped in the 2018 midterms, allowing Democrats to take control of the House. Working America has already talked to working class Trump voters in swing states and found that 1 in 4 of them is ready to ditch Trump in 2020. Most of them even support the Green New Deal, and most do not support a border wall. We need the base, but we need some of these folks too. 23 million is too many to write off as deplorable. In addition to winning elections, which is always nice, I also believe the more we can have constructive conversations, the more likely we are to find common ground. It's not always available, and I'm not suggesting compromise for the sake of compromise when the compromise on the table isn't a just one. What I am saying is that sometimes, if we stop seeing each other as enemies, we might actually find a way forward. There was an experiment where they presented a group of Israelis with an Israeli-authored peace plan. They all read the same plan, but half of the test group was told that Israelis had authored the plan, and the other half was told that Palestinians had created it. Guess which half liked the plan and which half hated it? We saw the same thing happen here in 2009, when Obama modeled his healthcare plan on a proposal developed years earlier by the conservative Heritage Foundation. But because it was now Obama's plan, Republicans reacted to it like it was radioactive. Again and again, political scientists have found that people take knee-jerk political stances based not on their substantive beliefs, but on their perception of whether it's a Republican or a Democratic proposal. This kind of us versus them mindset seems to be hardwired. We can't eradicate it, but we can try to avoid hardening the divisions. There's a young DNA water protector named Lila June Johnston, who's now running for office in New Mexico to try to stop fossil fuel devastation of the region. She talks a lot about how we can't win by hating and othering the oppressors. We are dehumanized when we slip into hatred toward them. Our hatred for them is no better than their hatred for us. It's the same hatred. If I go into that same delusion that we're enemies, then I'm just as deluded as they are. Trump loves the us versus them mindset, and he is going to keep playing his role as divider in chief and would love for us to play along and deepen the divide. I don't want to play a role that Trump has scripted for me. And so what I'm proposing in this book is a shift from diatribe to dialogue. The original Greek meaning of the word diatribe is a waste of time. Think about that, a waste of time. Dialogue is the flow of meaning between people. When you're in dialogue with someone, what powerful non-defensive communication teaches is to shift from an adversarial, accusatorial stance to one that communicates your position with humility and authenticity. Instead of, I'm right, what do you believe? Here's what I believe. Instead of, you're wrong, here are some things you may not have considered, but I don't want to try to convince you. Instead of, you're an idiot, here are some questions I have about your sources, and here's why I have trust in the data I'm relying on. Instead of, you're a bigot, this is the negative impact I see your beliefs having on society. And instead of, I hate you, at the end of the day, we both want what we think is best for society, and we have different ideas as to what's best and how to get there. Here are the problems I have with your vision, and here's my vision. Dialogue across lines of difference isn't a silver bullet. There are so many huge problems, like voter suppression, media disinformation, money in politics, and the two-party establishment. As we're chipping away at each of these problems, I believe we'll be more effective if we treat our adversaries like human beings instead of shaming and browbeating them. We know there's plenty of wrongdoing on the part of the right, and many books have been written about that. But what part of our failure do we need to take accountability for? What things are we doing that feel good but aren't good because they put people on the defensive and make them automatically reject what we're saying without even considering it? What can we do better so that we can increase our power without inspiring a vicious backlash on the part of those whose power we challenge? I think a key strategic communication question the left needs to be asking itself right now is, what are the benefits of being condescending and snide? And what are the benefits of being, for lack of a better word, civil? by which I mean speaking the truth, but not to punish, or to put it another way, bridging, not breaking. The benefits of trashing and bashing other people: it's fun, it's gratifying. We can bond with each other in our contempt for the other side. And that's pretty much it. The benefits of bridging are many. We can protect and repair strained relationships. We might learn something new or teach someone something new. We can increase trust and decrease the factionalism, which is making national politics dysfunctional and is making society less resilient and more vulnerable to despotism. We can make political discourse more palatable for the vast majority of Americans who say they are too disgusted and exhausted to engage anymore. We can possibly find common ground. We won't always find it, but we can try, and if we don't try, we certainly won't find it. And last but not least, we can make people feel heard so that not feeling heard is not a reason to vote for Trump. There is no way around the existence of 63 million Trump voters. As one of them said to me, if Democrats win in 2020, we're not going to just slink away, you know. And if Trump is reelected, then we're still sharing a country with them. And we'll be far better off if they see us as human beings whose well-being matters. Martin Luther King said, I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other, because they are separated from each other. Like King, I see the culture of separation as a disease that threatens to bring humanity down. When we feel disconnected from the natural world, we trash it. And when we feel disconnected from each other, we trash each other. And when we keep trashing each other, we move further and further apart until trust and goodwill dry up and blow away. And in this depleted soil, the only thing that can grow and thrive is hatred. The things we do as individuals ripple out 3 degrees into the world. Our actions affect the people we interact with, and the people they interact with, and the people they interact with. So while it may feel small and insignificant for little old you to have a conversation with your Trump-supporting Aunt Mary, it isn't small, it's huge. We are all making and remaking culture every moment of every day. And the only question is, what kind of a culture do we want to make? Disconnected and hateful, or connected and compassionate? As a progressive, one of my core values is the belief that we're all in this together and that we'll be better off if we cooperate. I can try to explain to a Republican why I believe this, but that won't go far if I'm not acting like we're all in this together. If they get the sense that by what I mean by all is everyone but them, because I'm better than them, then my little sermon about compassion and cooperation will ring hollow. If I really believe that we're all in this together, and I do, then I have to resist the temptation to act self-righteous, no matter how absolutely sure I am right. I am. I'll end with one final piece of wisdom from Dr. King. To retaliate with hate and bitterness would do nothing but intensify the existence of hate in the universe. Someone must have sense enough and morality enough to cut off the chain of hate. If we are willing to cut off the chain of hate and speak the truth, but not to punish, we may open hearts and minds in ways we never thought possible. Thank you.